I'm K.S. Dakshinamurthy. Welcome to the Federal. India-US relationship is always been a fascinating subject. And there is a lot of curiosity and a lot of stakes are, impinging on this particular relationship. To discuss this and also the book that's she's come out with, we have Seema Sirohi, a very senior journalist who left for the US 3 decades ago. And since then has been monitoring US foreign policy, particularly with South Asia and focus, obviously including India, very closely. And she's really followed and tracked this relationship. So, and, just I think this week, earlier this week, she had this, her book, Friends with Benefits, the India-US story. And it really is filled with her insights on how the relationship has progressed or how it's moved. So it's great to have you, Seema, with us to discuss this book and your insights into India-US foreign policy.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I look forward to our discussion.
Yeah. So, Seema, this what intrigued me first was the title itself, Friends with Benefits. So, I mean, how did you arrive at this title and, what's the logic behind it?
Well, to be perfectly honest, the title was given to me by a friend. We were struggling to get a good title. And basically, it means that India and the US, India is more than a friend, but less than an ally. India is not a treaty ally of the United States, but it's not. It's also more than a friend. So it's somewhere in between. The idea was to give that sense and also to have a play on words.
Okay, great. Okay. I was skimming through your book, also read certain parts of it quite closely. You make a very interesting observation about second generation Indians in the US. And you say that they are more left-leaning than their parents were. And it's really not necessary that they have a kind of they're invested in India, to quote your words. So, I mean, what does it mean and how does it imply, particularly since, Kamala Harris is now the vice president. And a lot of people, especially Indians, felt that this is going to in some way, help India or make India more important. Yeah.
It's my impression that the second generation Indian Americans are not that invested in India. There's been no study as such, but the people I talk to, on a daily basis, I meet a lot of them in my work, and many of them are part of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And very few Indian Americans are in the Republican Party. So it's just my impression that they kind of abide by this, left-leaning ideology of the progressive wing, which is now become quite an important part of the Democrats. As for Kamala Harris, as you know, that she, for a long time, emphasized more her African-American roots than the South Asian roots. She grew up as an African-American, was going to church there. But it's when she started to run, when she ran for president, before she became vice president, she started to emphasize the Indian side of things, which is fine. Somebody can have multiple identities. There's no problem.
Right.
But her being vice president doesn't mean that, suddenly India would be in the forefront or anything like that. That relationship is between governments and not between individuals. So if people thought that just because Kamala Harris is vice president, some more benefits will come to India, I think that's not the case.
Yes. What you're saying about the second generation Indians in some ways goes against the grain or, a general thinking that you have a very strong lobby of Indians in the US who support, let's say, the right-wing government in India, the Modi government. So how do you reconcile that with your view that, there are, the Indians are kind of the second generation are, more aligned to the left?
here's the contradiction, and I hope I can explain it well. Most of the Indian Americans vote for the Democratic Party in the United States because that's where they think their interests are best protected. The Democratic Party is pro-immigrant, it's pro, healthcare, pro sort of lot of the liberal values that Indian Americans like. But when it comes to their support for the Modi government in India, there is a divide in their mind. Somehow, Prime Minister Modi enjoys a lot of support there among the NRIs, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily vote Republicans, or they're voting for their interests because now they're American citizens. So they can
Right.
support anybody outside the country. It really doesn't matter. When it comes to their interests, they'll vote their interests. And that's,
Right.
they
So
see, they see the Democratic Party as a better home for their ideas and interests.
one can give a harsh, comment to that, in the sense that probably there's an element of double standards there. I mean, would you think?
Of course there is.
In,
They
the view of
are,
many, yeah. Yeah.
many Indian Americans have come to the United States, and but they're not necessarily pro-immigration. They're pro-immigration to the extent that they want their families to come, but not necessarily, widespread immigration for other communities. So yes, people are full of double standards. I mean, that's not news.
If you go back in time, you see that there has always been a fascination say among the common people or the general public in India for the US, though politically India was close to the Soviet Union. This kind of a liking for the US, or this aspirational thing to go to the US, or, both coexisted. So, which means that there was a kind of a dichotomy between official policy and a public perception of the US. Do you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, I mean,
Fascination for the US?
there's a perfect example of double standards for you right there. Official policy was somewhat, anti-US in the 80s and even, 70s, 80s, and 90s. But those very officials who were making the policy, their kids were studying in the US. So, as for the aspirational generation of Indians who have wanted to go to the US to study and to work, they went there for opportunities. They found that they were able to get those research opportunities, etc., that they weren't able to get in India. So some of our best brains went to the United States, and it's not the fault of the United States. We were not able to provide the avenues that they wanted.
Yeah.
And in that sense, the people of India were kind of ahead of the government of India in terms of, favoring the US over the Soviet Union, or Russia later on, or China. Now, of course, more and more students are going to China to study. Yeah. But still, the first place that people want to go to study is the United States.
Yeah. In fact, we can see that the craze for the US, of course, has gone up exponentially. In fact, India is probably amongst the countries that has the maximum line. There is a 3-year waiting list for first-time visa seekers. Suppose you apply today, you'll get an interview only after 3 years. And the US is now desperately trying to somehow cut short that line and do something to speeden up this process. So my question really is, since the number of Indians in the US, has actually gone up tremendously in the last, say, about 10, 20 years, do you think that even this can kind of lead to a kind of a pushback within the US? Because after all, there are a limited number of jobs, opportunities. So the people who are the, Americans, the white Americans or the black Americans, you think there's a kind of a, friction, tension that might happen going forward?
At some level, it's already happening. There is some resentment against H-1B visa workers who come to the United States in great numbers. And many white Americans are upset about that because they feel that Indians work at lower wages and therefore lower the wages for them, and they cannot get the salaries that they deserve. So that bit of resentment is already there. But overall, there is a shortage of people who, studies STEM subjects, what they call, mathematics and technology and
Right.
science and things like that. There is a shortage of graduates in that. So to that extent, I don't see any official clampdown coming, in terms of wanting Indian students. Indian students have become kind of, they have helped the American economy grow. Indian workers, especially in the tech sector, absolutely, the Americans can't do without them. Look at all the big companies. Many of
Mhm.
them are headed by Indian Americans.
Mhm. Okay, and also, in your book, you point out how India and the US were once frenemies, and today they are strategic partners. So, so what's the shift that you're hinting at?
When I first went to the United States, I mean, India and the US had a very difficult
Yeah.
relationship, I should say. It was a very testy relationship. There was not very much in common. The Americans saw India as like a giant headache, basically, because India always opposed the United States on every issue. India saw the United States as the country that had sent the Seventh Fleet during the Bangladesh War to threaten India.
Yeah.
And India saw the US as a protector of Pakistan. So there were many sources of suspicion between the two countries. Americans saw India as being part of the Soviet bloc, pretty much, even though it was non-aligned, but it was seen de facto as part of the Soviet bloc. So all that made convergence very difficult. But over a period of time, things changed. And as the Indian economy grew after the economic reforms by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, things began to change. The Americans began to take notice. Then the IT sector made a huge impact during Bill Clinton's time. And the Americans started to take India more seriously. And during the Kargil War, if you remember, in 1999, it was the first time an American president openly sided with India and said that Pakistan had to go back to its side of the line of control. So then came the nuclear deal between India and the US. George W. Bush and Manmohan Singh worked this out. That was a very seminal agreement. It showed that the Americans were looking at India as a friend and not as a hostile power. And things have been on the up and up since then. And the rise of China has contributed greatly to India and the US coming together.
Now that India is closer to the US, and I know independently on a bilateral level, and also as part of the Quad, which is a larger grouping which includes Japan and Australia, but fundamentally led by the US. Um, do you think this is going to cause problems for India vis-a-vis China? Okay, and whether India has the ability to take on China if China gets more aggressive, if India moves closer to the US, especially as part of the Quad? That's the
Look,
question.
when India wasn't close to the US, it wasn't as if the Chinese were not grabbing territory. We've had incidents on the line of actual control throughout when we weren't such good friends with the US. I don't think that's why China is doing what it's doing in terms of incursions. China is doing what it's doing because it feels its time has come. it's going to be the superpower number one, wants to displace the United States. If you read any of the statements of President Xi Jinping, it's very clear they have a plan to dominate the world order. So it doesn't help India to not have friends. India by itself cannot take on China. That's for sure. Not now, perhaps later. So it needs a network of friends to deter China. The only way, the game in town is deterrence. It's not, taking on like with a kinetic war or something like that, but building alliances, building partnerships with countries that are powerful, that have the means that India doesn't have right now. So we actually don't have a choice. I say in my book, the partnership with the US has become somewhat imperative. And if the US is with India and along with the other democracies like Australia and Japan, that gives some kind of a fencing vis-a-vis China.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody can take on
Right.
anybody alone anymore.
So I take your point. But, as far as the US is concerned, okay, the US has its own interests. And obviously, India falls somewhere within their, right now, their positive thinking and how they can use India in a geopolitical context. Okay, so now you know this the other question that is constantly being asked is, for the US, who is more important today? Is it Pakistan or India? And at one time it looked Pakistan was closer to, obviously, to the US. Today, how does this work?
There's no question that at one time Pakistan was extremely important for the US. When the war in Afghanistan was going on, the US was trying to defeat the Soviet Union through that covert war. Now that the US is out of Afghanistan, the
Right.
importance of Pakistan has reduced. The quality of the relationship the US has with India is very different from what it has with Pakistan. India and the US are cooperating in just about every domain of human endeavor. Whether it's space, whether it's technology, whether it's the newfangled, critical technologies. The National Security Advisor just went to Washington. So there is no comparison at all anymore. So, I feel that people in India should recognize that. It seems, we have to come out of that frozen time. Okay, yeah, at one stage, US was very close to Pakistan, but not anymore. The Pakistanis have very few friends left in Washington now.
Now that there is a sizable number of Indians and Indian Americans in the US, politically, is it strong enough to lobby for India's interests in the US? Like, I wouldn't compare it with Israel, but something along those lines, where you have a powerful, lobbying group that works for India's interests vis-a-vis the US.
Well, Indian Americans are certainly a growing force. They have more political clout now than they did before. There are 5 Indian American Congress men and women in the House of Representatives. So clearly, their clout has grown compared to the size of the community. So Indian Americans are just 1% of the population. In terms of exercising political influence, they have to organize themselves a little bit better. They have to create kind of a pan-American organization, which they don't have. They have pockets of activity in different parts of the country. But if you're comparing to the groups that pro-Israel groups, they are very, very organized, and they have a chapter in every major city in America, even small towns. And everybody donates money, and they have a national outfit, national office. That's not the case with Indian. And there's also a lot of division now in the diaspora, in the Indian diaspora. The religious divide of India has sort of reached the United States. Hindu Americans are kind of on one side, Muslim Indian Americans are on another side. So that's very unfortunate. It's but the domestic politics of India has reached the domestic politics of the United States.
So it means that we cannot really reap the benefits of this vast number of people, Indian immigrants, who are now in the US fundamentally.
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that they're not organized yet. It doesn't mean they cannot become organized. When India and the US were negotiating the nuclear deal, the Indian diaspora was hugely important in sort of convincing congressmen and senators to vote for the deal, because the US Congress had to approve the deal. And some key Indian Americans were very important in convincing those members of Congress. So it can happen if there's a huge issue on which the community can come together. It can happen again. But the question is, who's going to organize them? Who is going to take the time to do it? First generation Indian Americans think very differently from the younger lot. So somebody has to devote, a lot of time to it.
Okay, I think which means that really the way forward is open, and hopefully we'll see a sequel from you to this book, or what may happen over the next 10 years. So great talking to you, Seema, and wonderful for those insights. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.